The Mediterranean Sea off Israel's coast has long been considered one of the safer waters for swimming in the region. Crystal blue waters stretch endlessly toward the horizon, while gentle waves lap against sandy shores that have welcomed families for generations. For decades, the beaches near Hadera have been a peaceful retreat, where children build sandcastles and couples walk hand in hand as the sun sets over the ancient waters. But beneath those tranquil waves, something extraordinary had been happening for years, something that would transform this peaceful coastline into the stage for one of the most shocking encounters between man and predator ever recorded in Israeli waters. It started innocently enough. Local marine biologists first noticed them in the early 2000s, shadows moving beneath the surface near the Orot Rabin power plant. The warm water discharged from the facility created an unusual microclimate in the Mediterranean, and it was attracting visitors that had never been seen in such numbers before. Dusky sharks and sandbar sharks, some growing up to 13 feet long and weighing over 750 pounds, began congregating in these heated waters during the cooler months. What started as a handful of occasional sightings grew into something unprecedented, a shiver of dozens of these magnificent predators gathering in the same area year after year. Word spread quickly through Israel's diving and marine photography communities. Here was a chance to witness something truly rare: large sharks in the Mediterranean, predictably present and seemingly tolerant of human presence. The location became a pilgrimage site for underwater photographers, marine enthusiasts, and thrill seekers. But as the years passed, the respectful distance maintained by early observers began to erode. Social media posts showing close encounters with the sharks went viral. Videos of swimmers touching the massive predators, feeding them, and even grabbing their tails spread across platforms, each post encouraging more reckless behavior. The Israel Nature and Parks Authority issued warnings. Swimming was officially banned in the area. Signs were posted, press releases were distributed. Conservation groups pleaded with authorities to take stronger action to separate people from the wild animals. The warnings went unheeded. Barak Tzach was not a reckless thrill seeker. The 45-year-old father of 4 was an experienced diver with a deep respect for marine life. He had visited these waters before, always maintaining proper distance, always following safety protocols. His wife Sarit would later describe him as someone who entered the water to dive and document the sharks, not to feed them or play with them. On that fateful Monday in April, Barak prepared for what he thought would be another routine documentation dive. He strapped on his snorkeling gear, checked his underwater camera, and made sure his camera stick was secure. A local fisherman accompanied him, someone familiar with the area and the sharks' behavior patterns. The Mediterranean was particularly active that day. It was the middle of a week-long holiday, and despite official warnings and swimming bans, dozens of people had flocked to the beach. Children splashed in the shallows while their parents watched nervously. Teenagers dared each other to get closer to the dark shapes moving beneath the surface. Videos from that day show the chaos that had become commonplace. Swimmers grabbing sharks by their tails, people throwing food into the water, creating feeding frenzies, children standing waist-deep in water as massive predators glided just feet away. What a huge shark! One man can be heard exclaiming in footage that would later circulate widely. "Whoa, he's coming toward us. Don't move," he calls to a young boy standing nearby. "I'm leaving," the child responds, showing more wisdom than many of the adults present. But Barak wasn't among the chaos. He entered the water methodically, professionally, with the respect that these apex predators demanded. His wife would later emphasize that he never touched the sharks, never fed them, never engaged in the reckless behavior that had become so common. The fisherman who accompanied him watched as Barak began his dive. The water was clearer than usual, visibility extending deep into the blue. Schools of fish moved like silver clouds, and in the distance, The unmistakable silhouettes of the sharks could be seen patrolling their territory. Barak descended slowly, his camera ready. These were endangered species, dusky and sandbar sharks, whose populations had been decimated by overfishing and habitat loss. This gathering represented one of the largest concentrations of these sharks in the Mediterranean, a phenomenon worthy of documentation and protection. For several minutes, everything proceeded normally. Barak maintained his distance, using his camera stick to gently redirect any sharks that approached too closely. The fishermen on the surface watched the dive unfold, occasionally calling down instructions or warnings. Then something changed. Perhaps it was the increased activity from other swimmers in the area. Perhaps it was the feeding that had been taking place throughout the day, altering the sharks' natural behavior patterns. Perhaps it was simply the unpredictable nature of wild predators that conservationists had been warning about for years. The fisherman called for Barak to return to shore. Whether he had spotted something concerning or was simply being cautious, his instincts told him it was time to end the dive. Barak began his slow ascent, following proper protocols to avoid startling the marine life around him. He was perhaps 30 meters from shore when it happened. The attack was swift and devastating. Witnesses on the beach described seeing the water suddenly churn and turn red. Screams echoed across the waves as people realized what was unfolding before their eyes. The fishermen immediately called for help, but it was already too late. Within minutes of the attack, Israeli police and rescue teams converged on Hadera Beach. The area was immediately cordoned off, and nearby beaches were closed as a precautionary measure. What followed was one of the most intensive search operations in Israeli maritime history. For 2 days, teams scoured the Mediterranean using boats, underwater cameras, and diving equipment. The Israel Nature and Parks Authority's Marine Rangers joined the effort, their intimate knowledge of the area's currents and topography proving invaluable. Doron El-Mashali, commander of the Fire and Rescue Unit leading the operation, coordinated the search from a command post established on the beach. Underwater cameras were deployed to scan the seafloor, while boats created search grids to ensure no area was left unchecked. The sharks remained in the area throughout the search, their presence a constant reminder of the predators that had claimed a life in these waters. Some continued to approach the search vessels, their behavior seemingly unchanged by the recent attack. As news of the incident spread, it sent shockwaves through Israel's small but passionate diving community. This was only the third recorded shark attack in the country's history. The last fatal attack had occurred in the 1940s, making Barak's death a statistical anomaly that somehow felt inevitable to those who had been warning about the dangerous interactions at Hadera. On Wednesday, 2 days after the attack, the search teams made a grim discovery. Remains found at the attack site were confirmed through identification procedures to belong to Barak Zak, the father of 4, the experienced diver who had entered the water with respect and caution, had become the victim of the very phenomenon he had sought to document. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Sarit Zak took to Facebook to share her husband's story and defend his memory against those who might assume he had been engaging in the reckless behavior that had become so common at the site. Her post painted a picture of a man who understood and respected marine life, who had taken every precaution, who had never fed or harassed the sharks. She described how he had used his camera stick to gently distance sharks that approached too closely, exactly as safety protocols recommended. Barak entered the water to dive and document the sharks, not to feed them or play with them, she wrote, her words carrying the weight of a widow's grief and the frustration of watching her husband's death become part of a larger narrative about human recklessness. The fisherman who had been with Barak corroborated her account, confirming that her husband had followed all safety protocols and had never touched or fed the sharks. His death was not the result of tourist foolishness or social media stunts. It was the tragic outcome of an encounter with wild predators whose behavior, despite years of observation, remained fundamentally unpredictable. Sarit's words served as a stark reminder that even when humans follow every rule, respect every boundary, and take every precaution, nature remains wild and uncontrollable. Her husband had done everything right, and it hadn't been enough. Barak's death highlighted a growing global phenomenon: the dangerous intersection of wildlife tourism, social media culture, and inadequate enforcement of safety regulations. From Yellowstone's hot springs to Australia's crocodile-infested rivers, popular wildlife viewing sites around the world have seen increasing incidents of dangerous human-animal interactions. The Hadera shark gathering had become a victim of its own success. What began as a rare opportunity for respectful wildlife observation had devolved into a circus of dangerous encounters. Videos circulating online showed people treating the massive predators like pets, grabbing their fins, feeding them by hand, and allowing children to swim among them. Yigael Ben-Ari, head of the Israel Nature and Parks Authority's Marine Rangers, had been sounding the alarm for years. His warnings about the unpredictable nature of wild animals had been largely ignored by a public hungry for dramatic social media content and close encounters with nature. The Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel had been equally vocal in their concerns. In statements released both before and after the attack, they described a situation where chaos has developed in the area, as fishermen, boats, divers, surfers, and snorkelers all intersected dangerously with wild animals not accustomed to being around crowds of people. Their calls for designated safe viewing areas, stronger enforcement of swimming bans, and better education about wildlife safety had fallen on deaf ears. The allure of swimming with sharks proved too strong for authorities to effectively control. International shark attack data provided sobering context for the tragedy. While shark attacks remain statistically rare, with only 71 confirmed bites worldwide in the previous year, the circumstances at Hadera had created conditions that significantly increased the risk of dangerous encounters. The combination of habituated sharks, increased human presence, feeding behavior, and inadequate crowd control had created a perfect storm of risk factors. Marine biologists studying the incident noted that the sharks' behavior had likely been altered by years of human interaction, making them less predictable and potentially more dangerous. In the days following Barak's death, Israeli authorities finally took decisive action. The beach at Hadera was closed indefinitely, and nearby beaches were placed under heightened surveillance. Additional signage was installed, and patrols were increased to prevent unauthorized swimming in the area. The shark population remained largely unaffected by the incident. These ancient predators, which had survived mass extinctions and millions of years of environmental change, continued their seasonal migration patterns as they had for millennia. The warm water discharge from the power plant continued to attract them, creating the same conditions that had originally drawn them to the area. Conservation groups used the tragedy as a rallying cry for better wildlife protection measures. They argued that Barak's death could have been prevented with proper crowd control, designated viewing areas, and stricter enforcement of existing regulations. The diving community mourned the loss of one of their own, while grappling with the implications for future wildlife photography and marine research. Barak's death served as a stark reminder that even experienced professionals face significant risks when working with large marine predators. His family established a foundation in his memory, dedicated to promoting safe and respectful wildlife observation practices. Their goal was to ensure that future generations could witness the wonder of marine life, without repeating the tragic circumstances that led to Barak's death. To understand what happened to Barak Zak, it's essential to examine the behavior and biology of the sharks that had made Hadera their seasonal home. Dusky sharks and sandbar sharks are both large, powerful predators with complex behavioral patterns that scientists are still working to fully understand. Dusky sharks, which can grow up to 13 feet in length, and weigh over 750 pounds, are apex predators with highly developed sensory systems. They can detect electrical fields generated by living organisms, sense vibrations in the water from great distances, and track chemical trails with remarkable precision. Sandbar sharks, while smaller at around 8 feet and 220 pounds, are equally formidable hunters with similar sensory capabilities. Both species are typically cautious around humans, and attacks are extremely rare, but their behavior can be influenced by environmental factors, food availability, and previous interactions with humans. The warm water discharge from the Orot Rabin power plant had created an artificial ecosystem that concentrated these normally dispersed predators in a relatively small area. This concentration, combined with years of human interaction, had likely altered their natural behavior patterns in ways that scientists were only beginning to understand. Marine biologists studying the Hadera phenomenon noted several concerning trends in the shark's behavior. They had become increasingly tolerant of human presence, sometimes approaching swimmers rather than avoiding them. They had also begun associating humans with food, thanks to years of people feeding them. These behavioral changes represented a dangerous shift from the shark's natural patterns. In the wild, these species typically avoid human contact, and attacks are almost always cases of mistaken identity. Sharks, confusing humans for their natural prey. At Hadera, however, the sharks had been conditioned to expect food from humans and had lost much of their natural wariness. This created a situation where the normal rules of shark-human interaction no longer applied. The attack on Barak occurred during what marine biologists call a feeding aggregation, a time when multiple sharks gather in response to available food sources. The presence of other swimmers feeding the sharks throughout the day had likely heightened their feeding response, making them more aggressive and less predictable. Even though Barak himself had not fed the sharks, he became a victim of the altered behavioral patterns created by years of inappropriate human interaction with these predators. The tragedy at Hadera reflects a broader global challenge in wildlife management and conservation. As human populations expand and tourism to natural areas increases, dangerous encounters between people and wildlife are becoming more common. Similar situations have developed at wildlife viewing sites around the world. In Yellowstone National Park, tourists regularly ignore warnings and approach dangerous animals for photographs, resulting in numerous injuries and deaths. In Australia, crocodile attacks have increased as development encroaches on natural habitats, and tourists seek closer encounters with these predators. The rise of social media has exacerbated these problems by incentivizing increasingly dramatic and dangerous interactions with wildlife. The desire for viral content has led people to take risks that previous generations would never have considered. Marine environments present particular challenges for wildlife management. Unlike terrestrial parks, where physical barriers can be erected and access controlled, ocean environments are inherently difficult to regulate. Swimmers, divers, and boaters can access wildlife areas from multiple directions, making comprehensive management nearly impossible. The Hadera shark gathering represents a unique case study in the challenges of managing human-wildlife interactions in marine environments. The predictable presence of large sharks in accessible waters created an irresistible attraction for thrill seekers and wildlife enthusiasts, but existing regulatory frameworks proved inadequate to manage the risks. International marine conservation organizations have pointed to the Hadera incident as an example of the need for new approaches to wildlife tourism management. They argue for stronger international cooperation, better enforcement mechanisms, and more effective public education campaigns about the risks of wildlife interactions. The economic implications of wildlife tourism also complicate management decisions. The shark viewing at Hadera had become a significant tourist attraction, bringing visitors and revenue to the local area. Balancing economic benefits with safety concerns creates difficult decisions for policymakers and conservation managers. Modern technology played a complex role in both creating and documenting the dangerous situation at Hadera. Underwater cameras and social media platforms enabled the documentation and sharing of shark encounters on an unprecedented scale, but they also incentivized increasingly risky behavior. The same technology that allowed Barak to document marine life professionally also enabled amateur thrill seekers to capture and share dangerous interactions with sharks. The viral nature of social media content meant that videos of people touching sharks or feeding them reached global audiences, inspiring copycat behavior and attracting more risk-takers to the site. Drone technology had also begun to play a role in shark monitoring and public safety. Aerial footage could track shark movements and provide early warnings to swimmers and divers, but the technology was not consistently deployed at Hadera despite the known risks. Advanced underwater camera systems, like those used in the search for Barak's remains, demonstrated the potential for technology to improve both research and rescue operations. However, the same technology that could enhance safety was often used instead to capture increasingly dramatic footage for social media consumption. The challenge for wildlife managers moving forward will be harnessing technology's potential for improving safety while mitigating its role in encouraging dangerous behavior. This may require new regulations on the use of underwater cameras in sensitive wildlife areas, restrictions on the sharing of certain types of wildlife interaction content, and better integration of monitoring technology into safety protocols. Barak Zak's death highlighted a fundamental paradox in marine conservation. The public interest generated by the Hadera shark gathering had raised awareness about these endangered species and their conservation needs. But the same interest had created conditions that ultimately proved fatal. Dusky and sandbar sharks face significant threats from overfishing, habitat loss, and climate change. Their slow reproductive rates make them particularly vulnerable to population declines, and both species are considered threatened or endangered in many parts of their range. The concentration of these sharks at Hadera represented an important conservation success story, proof that protective measures and habitat restoration could create conditions where marine predators could thrive. The warm water discharge from the power plant had inadvertently created a sanctuary where sharks could gather in numbers not seen elsewhere in the Mediterranean. However, the human activity attracted by this conservation success ultimately threatened the very animals it was meant to protect. The stress of constant human interaction, the alteration of natural feeding patterns, and the risk of injury from careless tourists all posed threats to the shark population. Conservation biologists studying the situation faced difficult decisions about how to balance public access and education with species protection. Complete exclusion of humans from the area would eliminate educational opportunities and public support for conservation, but continued unregulated access posed risks to both sharks and humans. The death of Barak Zak forced a re-evaluation of these trade-offs. His widow's establishment of a foundation promoting safe wildlife observation represented an attempt to find a middle ground, maintaining public engagement with marine conservation while emphasizing the respect and caution that these powerful predators demand. The investigation into Barak's death revealed systemic failures in wildlife management, public education, and regulatory enforcement. Despite years of warnings from conservation groups and marine biologists, authorities had failed to implement effective measures to prevent dangerous human-shark interactions. The swimming ban at Hadera had been largely symbolic, with no meaningful enforcement mechanism. Signs warning of dangers were easily ignored, and the absence of physical barriers meant that determined swimmers could access the water regardless of official prohibitions. The lack of designated viewing areas meant that people seeking to observe the sharks had no safe alternative to entering the water. This created a situation where even well-intentioned wildlife enthusiasts like Barak were forced to take significant risks to pursue their interests. The incident also revealed gaps in emergency response capabilities. While rescue teams responded quickly to the attack, the remote location and challenging conditions made effective intervention nearly impossible. Better communication systems, pre-positioned rescue equipment, and improved coordination between agencies might have improved response times, though they likely would not have changed the outcome in this case. The role of social media in promoting dangerous behavior became a particular focus of post-incident analysis. Videos of people interacting with sharks had gone viral repeatedly, each one inspiring more risk-taking behavior. The platforms hosting this content faced questions about their responsibility for the consequences of viral wildlife interaction videos. Educational institutions also came under scrutiny for their role in preparing people for wildlife encounters. Many diving certification programs included minimal training on large marine predator safety, and wildlife photography courses often emphasized getting close shots without adequately addressing the risks involved. The medical response to shark attacks also proved to be an area requiring improvement. Israeli hospitals had little experience treating shark attack victims, and emergency responders lacked specific protocols for these types of injuries. The rarity of shark attacks in Israeli waters meant that relevant expertise was limited. Barak Zak's death sent shockwaves through Israel's small but passionate marine community. Dive shops reported cancellations and increased requests for safety training. Marine photography groups implemented new safety protocols and began requiring additional training for members planning to photograph large marine life. The incident also had international implications. Marine conservation organizations around the world used the tragedy as a case study in the dangers of unregulated wildlife tourism. The specific circumstances at Hadera, predictable wildlife presence, inadequate crowd control, and social media-driven risk-taking were recognized as factors present at numerous other wildlife viewing sites globally. Insurance companies began re-evaluating their coverage of marine wildlife activities, with some excluding coverage for activities involving large predators. This had immediate impacts on dive operators and marine tour companies, forcing them to implement stricter safety protocols to maintain coverage. The scientific community also felt the impact of Barak's death. Research projects studying the Hadera shark population faced new restrictions and safety requirements. Some studies were suspended indefinitely, while new protocols were developed. The local fishing community, which had coexisted with the sharks for years, found themselves under increased scrutiny. Some fishermen had been supplementing their income by guiding tourists to shark viewing areas, and these informal operations came under regulatory review following the attack. Tourism to the area declined sharply in the immediate aftermath of the incident, affecting local businesses and communities that had benefited from the shark-related tourism. This economic impact added another layer of complexity to decisions about how to manage the site moving forward. In the months following her husband's death, Sarit Zak became an unlikely advocate for marine safety and conservation. Her foundation, established in Barak's memory, focused on promoting responsible wildlife observation and supporting research into human-wildlife interaction safety. The foundation's work included developing educational materials for divers and marine photographers, funding research into shark behavior modification caused by human interaction, and advocating for improved safety protocols at wildlife viewing sites. Sarit's advocacy was particularly powerful because she could speak from personal experience about the consequences of inadequate safety measures. Her husband had been an experienced, cautious diver who had followed all recommended safety protocols, yet he had still fallen victim to the dangerous conditions created by years of regulatory failure. The foundation also worked to preserve Barak's photographic work, using his images to educate people about marine life, while emphasizing the importance of maintaining respectful distances from wild animals. His photographs served as a reminder that meaningful wildlife documentation could be achieved without the extreme close-up encounters that had become popular on social media. Through speaking engagements and media interviews, Sarit worked to change public perceptions about wildlife interactions. She emphasized that true respect for animals meant accepting that they were wild and potentially dangerous, rather than treating them as entertainment or photo opportunities. The Foundation's research initiatives focused on understanding how human activity affects shark behavior and developing guidelines for safer wildlife observation. This work had implications beyond the Hadera site, contributing to global efforts to improve human-wildlife interaction safety. Despite the tragedy and subsequent closure of the beach, the sharks continued to return to Hadera each year. The warm water discharge from the power plant continued to attract them, and their seasonal migration patterns remained unchanged by the human drama that had unfolded in their territory. Marine biologists continued to monitor the shark population, now with enhanced safety protocols and restricted access. The research revealed that the shark's behavior gradually began to return to more natural patterns as human interaction decreased. The absence of feeding by tourists led to reduced aggression and a return to more typical hunting behaviors. The sharks became more wary of human presence, suggesting that their previous habituation had been learned behavior rather than permanent behavioral modification. This behavioral recovery provided hope that the damage caused by years of inappropriate human interaction could be reversed with proper management. However, it also served as a reminder of how quickly wildlife behavior can be altered by human activity. The continued presence of the sharks at Hadera also kept alive the possibility of future human-shark encounters. Despite beach closures and increased enforcement, determined individuals occasionally attempted to access the water, creating ongoing safety concerns. Researchers studying the site began developing new approaches to wildlife viewing that would allow public observation while minimizing risks. These included elevated viewing platforms, underwater camera systems that could provide live feeds to shore-based observers, and guided tours that maintained safe distances from the sharks. The goal was to find a way to satisfy public interest in these magnificent predators while preventing the dangerous interactions that had led to Barrick's death. This represented a new model for wildlife tourism that prioritized safety and conservation over dramatic close encounters. Barakzak's death occurred against the backdrop of increasing global concerns about human-wildlife conflict. Climate change, habitat destruction, and growing human populations were bringing people and dangerous animals into contact more frequently than ever before. Marine environments were experiencing particular stress from these factors. Rising ocean temperatures were altering marine ecosystems and changing predator distribution patterns. Coastal development was eliminating traditional wildlife habitats and forcing animals into closer contact with human populations. The Mediterranean Sea itself was undergoing significant ecological changes. Warming waters were attracting species that had previously been rare in the region, while overfishing was disrupting traditional food webs. These changes created new and unpredictable dynamics in human-wildlife interactions. The Hadera shark gathering represented both the opportunities and challenges presented by these changing conditions. The concentration of endangered sharks in accessible waters provided unprecedented opportunities for research and education, but it also created new risks that existing management frameworks were ill-equipped to handle. International marine conservation organizations began using the Hadera case as a model for developing new approaches to wildlife tourism management. The specific combination of factors that led to the tragedy, predictable wildlife presence, inadequate regulation, social media influence, and economic incentives, were recognized as challenges facing wildlife viewing sites worldwide. The development of new international guidelines for marine wildlife tourism became a priority for conservation organizations. These guidelines emphasized the need for science-based management decisions, adequate enforcement mechanisms, and comprehensive public education programs. The economic dimensions of wildlife tourism also received increased attention following the Hadera incident. The tragedy demonstrated that short-term economic benefits from unregulated wildlife tourism could lead to long-term costs in terms of human safety, wildlife conservation, and destination reputation. As these harrowing stories from the Mediterranean demonstrate, the line between wonder and terror in our encounters with marine predators remains razor-thin. The sharks of Hadera continue to patrol those warm waters, their ancient instincts unchanged by human tragedy, while families around the world still venture into oceans where these apex predators hunt. From the beaches of Israel to coastlines across the globe, these shocking encounters remind us that we remain visitors in the domain of creatures that have ruled the seas for millions of years. If you're gripped by these tales of when humans face nature's most formidable predators, hit that like button and subscribe for more harrowing stories of shark encounters that will leave you questioning every step into ocean waters. Every week, we bring you the most shocking true accounts of survival and tragedy from the world's most dangerous waters. Because you never know when you might find yourself face to face with the ocean's ultimate predator.